price that was a little too high. What would happen? Then demand would be greater than supply, right? And so you would raise the price again. And then demand would be even greater than supply, and you would raise the price again. And you would never get back to the equilibrium, right? The opposite thing happens here. Even though we've got the demand and supply curves both going downward, if we raise the price a little bit, demand is greater than supply, and so, supply is greater than demand, so the price comes back down, and vice versa. So we always go back to the equilibrium. OK, so what that tells us is that what is required to get the right comparative statics, that the price should fall, is not really that both demand and supply go in the right direction. It's rather that we're at an equilibrium that's stable. And that sort of makes sense, because remember from an individual maximization problem, if you looked at a local minimum, your comparative static would go in the wrong direction. Similarly, if you look at an unstable equilibrium, everything would go in the wrong direction if you tried to do a comparative static, right? Because if you're at a local minimum and the price rises, I'm actually going to buy more of the thing if I'm trying to minimize my utility, right? OK. Now, when there's multiple products, the definition of stability gets a little bit uglier, because the notion of second derivatives, having negative second derivative, gets a little bit more complicated. But the same basic intuition is going to hold. So the general point here is that just like you always check second order conditions in an individual maximization problem, you should always, in an equilibrium, check to make sure that it's a stable equilibrium. OK. So just as in the case of pure trade, with production, all equilibria are going to be efficient. And the reason is that all the different companies are now going to set their production possibilities frontiers tangent to one another in the same way that everyone was setting their marginal rates of substitution tangent to one another, right? So all these things are sort of going to be tangent. And again, we know that that's true just from what we did in producer theory, right? That we always set the marginal rate of transformation equal to the ratio of the prices, which from consumers, we know they set equal to their marginal rates of substitution. Again, the use of any resource is set to have the same utility and set so that anytime you can transform a resource into another, you do that according to the ratio of the marginal utilities that consumers get. So everything becomes tangent, and we achieve efficiency. So in some sense, production is no different than consumption, right? Here we've done things in terms of some money, right? That's what these prices represent. But we could always just do it instead in terms of utility, right? And that would be the same as an individual maximization problem, right? In an individual maximization problem, you always just use a Lagrangian to set the marginal utility of different things equal to the ratio in which you can change them into one another. And so that's basically all that the fundamental welfare theorem says, is that any problem that you're doing inside your head maximizing, you could always do by thinking about there being prices in which you, trade different goods for one another. That's all the Lagrange multiplier is. So when you solve an individual maximization problem using a Lagrange multiplier, all you're doing is finding the market prices that you need in order to get you to exactly consume what you have available to you. And conversely, any market is just going to implement the same thing that a social planner would implement if they were managing the resources for the economy, right? So what this means is that markets can be a useful device for computing optimal allocations. And this is used in situations that are often considered non-market. So Jacob Rabinowitz, could you tell me what some of the sort of unusual uses of markets are? Do you have some ideas?
I already read the slides, but there was a poster for an event outside about the marriage matching.
Yeah. Yeah, so this guy, Al Roth, actually, this past Monday, won the Nobel Prize for one of these. Yeah. And Gary Becker part of what he got the Nobel Prize for was related to this as well. So one example, yeah, as Jacob said, is marriage matching. So Gale, Shapley in 1962 and Becker in 73 said that marriage is like a market. So people try to get the best mate they possibly can, given the set of people who are willing to take them. Gale and Shapley proposed a centralized market mechanism that could be used for doing marriages. And in fact, that was implemented for matching people to their places they could get a residency as a medical doctor or places where they could get a kidney. Basically, what all those systems are is just a system of barter, right? So the way that the kidney exchange works is it looks for people, it looks at the types of kidneys that they need, and then it looks at the types of kidneys that other people are willing to give, and it tries to find cycles of people who I give my kidney to this guy, he gives it to that guy, and it comes back to me, and then everybody gets the kidney that they need, right? And that's really just a market. It's a disguised market because people don't like to think of there being a market for kidneys. So they call it by some complicated name and they talk about some algorithm and whatever. But in reality, all it is just finding a way to create a market so people can trade their kidneys, right? Another example of this is course allocation. So I don't know how course signups work here at Chicago, but they're probably not ideal. Eric Budish proposed a mechanism to use a market to do this, where everyone would be given some currency, and then there would be like a Walrasian equilibrium in all the prices of all the courses that's formed. I talked about that on Tuesday with the other class. And if everyone gets the same amount of fake money, it's fair, right? Because if you were able to get a set of courses, and I want to get those, I could always buy them because I have the same amount of money that you have. Perhaps in the future, markets can also be used in sort of a centralized way to this to do delegated financial investing. So good investing is actually a really complicated thing for any of us to do. I don't know if you guys have ever looked into thinking about planning your financial futures, but it's a real headache. But for a computer, it's really, really easy to compute all these risk-return trade-offs and what's the optimal thing given the risks you face in your life. And so if you were to give your information to a computer, then a computer could run an internal market, compute what was the best investment, and in fact, then you wouldn't even need, if everyone was doing that, you wouldn't even need to have like a financial market or anything like that. You could have it all just happen instantaneously. So I go and buy something from Jacob immediately rather than me having to like sell my stocks, get the money into the bank, hand him cash, then it goes back. It could just be transferred some dollars from my account to his account, and then our portfolios could be re-optimized in real time. Think about how much more efficient that would be than the current system that we have for investing, right? And this would be fast and easy for people, no need for physical currency, et cetera. Okay. The second fundamental welfare theorem also still holds. So any Pareto optimal allocation can be achieved by using the market. You just have to transfer the right amount of money from people. And this leads economists not to want to intervene for redistributive purposes in ways that distort the market. They say money should be redistributed directly, and then we should allow a market to operate. Now, David Wang,
yes.
Why is that difficult to do in practice?
Is it because it kind of like requires knowledge of like what people's preferences are?
Well, you don't necessarily need to know people's preferences, but what do you need to know about them in order to redistribute money from them to other people?
How much money they have?
Yeah, so the question is, how much money does someone have? Well, it might sound like, well, you know how much cash you have, but most of the wealth that you have is locked up in the labor income that you'll get for the rest of your life, right? And if you start taxing people's actual income, well, then you're not taxing the amount of money they have. Because the amount of money they have is the potential that they have to earn money, not the amount of money they actually earn. Because how much money they actually earn depends on how much time they devote to work, what career they choose to do, et cetera. And if you start taxing those things, then you actually distort decisions that people make, right? The problem is that, you know, the wage rate that you might earn is partly determined by the effort that you make, and it's even hard to figure out what your wage rate is in most jobs. It's really hard to know what people's potential job is, right? So imagine that we said, okay, we're going to be brilliant, and we're just going to know how much potential income everyone in this room has. And rather than charging them based on their income so we don't distort decisions, so we follow the prescriptions of the first fundamental welfare theorem, we're just going to go around and say, you owe the government this much money, you owe the government that much money, based on our prediction of how much potential income you have in your life. What would then happen if someone who seems talented decides they want to live like a bum? Louis, what would you have to do to that person?
Well, aren't you taking money from them in the system because you predicted that they were going to...
Well, I mean, yeah, Louis, you're really talented. You're going to make $3 million if you do the efficient thing. So you now owe the government $3 million. Now imagine that you decide to go out and live like a bum or do whatever you feel like doing. What would the government then have to do?
It would have to... Well, I owe the government $3 million now.
Yeah, and how does it collect that money if you're living like a bum? It can't, so what's it going to have to do to you? Send you off to like a slave labor camp in Siberia, right? Right? So actually, what is the second fundamental welfare theorem? It has nothing to do with what we would call capitalism. It's exactly the Soviet system, right? It says you owe this much to the state, right? And if you don't do it, we're going to ship you off for re-education or something like that, right? So I mean, in fact, the second fundamental welfare theorem is nothing capitalist at all. It's basically from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And if you don't come through on what you owe with your ability, we ship you off to a slave labor camp, right? A lot of people don't find that very appealing. And that's the reason why the second fundamental welfare theorem is so hard to apply in practice. Now, the closest to applying it, I think, that's ever occurred has been Henry George's suggestion of a land tax. Because land is something that you really can figure out its value, and you don't have to, you can figure out its value, and therefore you can just tax people based on that. So he said we should just tax away the land. What does that mean? That means that all the land should be owned by the government and just leased or rented to people, right? But even that's a little problematic, because if you think about how did people originally get their land, mostly it was like the king granted some land to a lord for serving him well in the military, right? So if we now tax away all the value that goes to his children of that land, that ex ante reduces the incentive of him to have fought hard in the battle, right? So, I mean, everything basically that we give was given out for some reason at some point. Now, maybe we want to sort of renege on that and start over with the government owning all the land and then distribute it in whatever. And that's the way that a lot of land reforms are based on. But as you quickly see, a lot of this stuff coming out of the second fundamental welfare theorem gets much more complicated when you actually think about the problems that we face. OK, so in practice, the second welfare theorem is interpreted a little bit differently. It's usually interpreted as saying redistribution should be as direct as possible. Taxes should fall on things like income or total consumption, which, while they might distort how much you work and so forth, don't distort how you allocate money across different things. A lot of economists oppose capital gains taxes because they think that it's your choice whether you want to consume your money as an old person or as a young person or leave it to your children, etc. The second thing is that redistribution should usually not affect the prices of goods. So many programs are sort of like aimed at subsidizing goods that are consumed by the poor. So for example, developing countries often have fuel subsidies or corn subsidies.